So we'll get started. To introduce myself, I'm John Situ. I'm a councillor in Southwark, and I sit on the cabinet there with specific responsibility for climate emergency. I'm really excited about today's discussion. We've got a fantastic panel, and I'll come on to the panel in a second. But I've got a couple of, I guess, housekeeping points to just raise. So the format of today's discussion will be firstly hearing from our panelists, and then there'll be an opportunity for a discussion afterwards, and then are encouraging people to submit questions through the discussion, because there'll be an opportunity to take some questions after the initial discussion as well. Just a flag, today's discussion will be recorded, so if you don't want to appear on camera, do switch off your cameras in that sense as well. Just before I introduce the panelists, as I'm sure you'll probably be aware, today's discussion, and particularly this panel discussion, is about creating a just transition to net zero. And it's fair to say that today's been all about ensuring that we are in line with our values as a Labour Party and a progressive Britain, ensuring that wealth and opportunity is shared, and we are meeting the challenges, leaving no one behind. And no bigger challenge is responding to the climate emergency. We're already seeing significant parts of our country at risk of floods. We've seen figures from Friends of the Earth, which have showed that particularly the north of England and southern Scotland are seen to see 11% increase in flood levels per decade over the next few decades as well. So we know this is significantly important, not just as what we offer to our communities right across the country, but also in line with our Labour values as well. So onto the panel. We've got a fantastic panel who will be speaking for 3 minutes each. To introduce them, firstly is Darren Jones MP, who's the chair of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Base Committee. We have Billington, who is director of UK 100, a network of UK locally elected leaders who have pledged to play their part in a global effort of ensuring that the worst impacts of climate change are avoided and communities are supported. And Melanie, who is Deputy CEO of Renewable UK and was a former MP for Grimsby as well. So I'm going to start off with Darren, and then there'll be an opportunity to head into a discussion afterwards. So over to you, Darren.
Thanks so much. Great to be with all of you this afternoon and see lots of my favourite people on the screen. So a pleasure to be here on a Sunday afternoon. My role in the House of Commons is to hold the government to account for the net zero transition and the delivery of COP26, the international climate summit that's happening later this year. So before we begin, though, I think we should just talk about what does a just transition mean, because actually it's not something new or novel. It's something that's in the DNA of the Labour Party and the Labour movement. It's about ensuring that the benefits of a macro transition in the British economy are shared widely, and that we support those who are affected the most by that transition. So just because we're talking about climate change doesn't mean that this is something kind of new and novel. It's something that we have, our history is based upon the just transition. And so it should therefore be, in my view, at the heart of all of our policy propositions and the leadership of our party, and I'll explain why now in a couple of minutes. To begin with, I think just climate change is one of two, in my view, macro forces changing the British economy and indeed the world. The second is technology. And when you mix climate change and technology together, you have a choice. You can either be shaped by them, or you can help shape them in the interest of the British economy and the British people. We know from the Tories that they're free marketeers. We've seen this time and time again. They set targets in statute, they announce strategy documents, but then they don't deliver. And they essentially say to the market, okay, this is what we want to do, go off and make it happen. The Green Homes Grant, which was the recent programme to insulate our homes, a really top priority for decarbonisation in our country, was a complete failure because they didn't structure it properly or deliver it properly. And that's why it's imperative that Labour's in government if we're going to ensure a just transition, because I don't think the Tories genuinely worry that much about a just transition, and they don't really know how to deliver it, but we do. And the risk is that if we aren't in a position to take power and to be in government, there will be two outcomes. There's a real life risk for people and that we failed to meet our climate targets, both in the UK and around the world, that will mean that there isn't a just transition and that people and communities will be left behind. And if we don't meet our targets globally, the way in which the world operates will change fundamentally. Our geopolitics and our national security will be completely changed to what we are dealing with today. And that's a huge risk for Britain, democracies, and indeed the world. And there is a political risk that we get overtaken by the Greens. Now, when I've said this before, people kind of laugh at me, and it's not just because I'm in Bristol, but I genuinely believe that unless we get this at the heart and centre of all of our policies, we're going to miss the big macro trend of the next century. And we could end up in a position like in Germany, where the Green Party takes over from the Socialist Party, because they're talking about the macro trend that's affecting people across their whole country. The Labour Party doesn't have a fundamental right to exist. We have to make that case. We can't just do it based on the industrial revolution that we've acted in the last century. We need to be talking about the next century and the climate transition that's going to take place and has to take place whether we like it or not. That has to be a just transition. That requires Labour to be in government, but it has to be at the core of our thinking if we're going to make a success of that. I wasn't timing myself, but I have a habit to go over, so I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that's all right.
That was perfect. Thank you, Darren. On to Polly.
Thanks very much, Johnson. It's lovely to be here and to be among friends who know and understand how important this is. I just want to refer back a little bit to some of the things that Cllr said this morning, because I think it's the context within which we need to frame this debate. He talked a lot about change this morning, and I agree with him that the party needs to change a lot in order to be able to meet the new challenges of the 21st century. But one thing that we really need to do to change is to understand that for a lot of people, change in the country is scary and it feels like it makes things worse, not better. Secondly, that pride of place is not just important, but it's essential to build the consent and support for the things we need to do. And thirdly, we need to draw on the expertise of elected Labour decision makers in the places who are in the places that we're talking about, who are best placed to help design the solutions the country needs, community by community. Now, why are those things important for climate change and the just transition? Well, fundamentally, the science is scary. Johnson laid it out. You can't negotiate with it. We're seeing the impacts now. But we as leaders of our own communities and in future of the country need to be able to reassure voters that we have answers and that they meet the needs of our communities now, not just in the future. This is my point, is you need to be talking about how it improves your lives now, not just in 2030, 2050 and so forth, which is one of the anxieties about targets and so forth. And also because all green jobs aren't necessarily good jobs, and you can't replace a miner in Mansfield with a sustainability professional in Shoreditch and say that's a way to a new economy. Neither can you offshore the net zero challenge. It will have to happen in every street and every community, so it needs to be designed with and for those communities. Now, in the past, our communities have experienced rapid deindustrialization. That goes to one of the things that Darren was talking about. So understandably, people are likely to want to cling on to the last well-paid unionized jobs in fossil fuel industries, unless we work hard with the trade union movement and the new green sectors to establish better working conditions, pay and prospects. This is, for example, it's not much fun talking about green jobs when then you find that solar panels are being made by oppressed Uyghur Muslims in China rather than well-paid people here in this country. And that also extends to the ununionized private sector. I always think about the car mechanics in railway arches across the country, with as much as it is about the Nissan workers in Sunderland. And remember, union membership has reduced quite considerably from 32% in 1995 to 23% in 2019. Union membership is important in being able to ensure that green jobs are good ones, but it's not the only answer. The past, however, does leave us a legacy for opportunity. Believe it or not, where those big heavy industries were, there's a lot of electricity grid capacity in order to be able to support steelworks, shipyards and so forth. That offers us places on our national grid where there's actually capacity to be able to grow new jobs. So this could be about rebalancing the economy back to some of those places that have lost out most. Right now, in the present, we have a need for a recovery. Our offer for what a recovery post-pandemic needs to look like must be both reassuring and enabling. The precariousness that people have felt through the pandemic, as far as money and jobs is concerned, has been felt by many for a long time, and actually drove the Brexit vote. I mean, Mel will probably talk more about that than I will, even though that might sound a little bit counterintuitive. Now, my organisation that I work with during the day, UK 100, published some research for our Resilient Recovery Task Force, which indicated that you could have 500,000 strong retrofit army could be established to kickstart the task of making our homes more energy efficient, ready for the cleaner heating kit that we need in the future. The government's response was the Green Home Grant, which is exactly what Darren's talked about. However, it wasn't a total disaster. Which bit worked? The local authority bit. Never forget that we have elected Labour representatives across the country making decisions every day that are actually well placed to help design and deliver some of those solutions now, because the science can't be negotiated with and certainly can't wait for a Labour government, but also inform the kind of political platform that we should be going to the country on in 23-24. A larger sort of strategic example of this is the UK Infrastructure Bank. I've seen a lot from our Labour front bench asking for a bigger bank. Forgive me for the macho politics on that, but this, rather than asking for a bigger one, we should be campaigning for a better one. It's not the size of it, it's what you do with all of that money that's really important. And in the future, our research indicates that about 3 million jobs will be affected by a shift to net zero, either because of the increase in demand or people's jobs will require them to be reskilled. That is a national mission we can focus on, because those jobs will no longer suck out talent out of Bassett Law and Bridgend, but instead restore options to people who have stayed in those communities and younger generations who want to be part of the communities they grew up in. But that requires some considerable letting go from Whitehall, and that will mean the Labour Party needs to think about that right now. So I would say there are a couple of things that we need to think about specifically in terms of the way that we frame this, as well as what we offer. We need to end the catastrophization of our politics. People don't believe you when you talk about the end of the world, or they freak out and feel powerless. Instead, we need to be talking about this in terms of hope and security. I would argue there's a couple of kind of underpinning things we should think about in terms of our offer at the next general election, which will work towards that just transition. Buses, bridges, and broadband are fundamentally what we're talking about when we're talking about transforming the kind of infrastructure we need in this country. And combine that with social care, skills, and family support, we start to have an offer that really speaks to the kind of anxieties people have now, as well as the ones that they have festering in the back of their mind about what the future means for them and their families.
Thank you, Polly, and I particularly welcome the nod to both local and regional authorities as well, and I'm sure that will come up in the discussion to come. Over to you, Melanie.
Thank you, Johnson. Okay, I'm going to start with being incredibly unpopular, but if I can't be challenging in an environment where we're coming off the back of the worst general election defeat since 1935, you know, a set of very, very mixed election results just a week and a half ago. I don't know when I can, because I think that the Labour Party is in trouble, and I think that if we say things like the Tories can't deliver a just transition, we might be kidding ourselves. From my new perspective, working very closely with the renewables sector, it is unprecedented, the amount of attention and direct conversations, access to government and funding that has been coming towards the renewables sector and directly investing in communities like Grimsby, like Teesside, like Lower Stofton, Great Yarmouth. And the test will be if that all sticks, and the test will be whether all of government and local authority and local enterprise partnerships and communities all link up properly together to embed that. I think that there is a conversation. We will sit here and we will talk about a just transition. I don't think that out there in the world people are talking about a just transition. I don't think if you went down your street and started talking to people about a just transition that they'd really understand what that meant. And so I think that there's a job of communication to do. One of the openings that I would say that is available to the Labour Party is that government seems to be expecting industry to do a lot of that communicating and rinsing its hands of the responsibility of having some pretty difficult conversations. And I think that the discussion around just transition is much more than just about jobs and more than new technology. And the Climate Change Committee's report at the back end of last year, I thought was really quite stark. And I know government doesn't really like the Climate Change Committee too much, was really stark in terms of how our lives would be expected to change, your life, my life, expected to change over the next 10, 20, 30 and 40 years. And looking around at everybody on the cameras that I can see, I think we'll all be still alive and kicking over that period of time. And I don't think that people are aware of that change that is going to come, some of which might happen naturally. I don't know, small things, you know, eradication of plastic bags. But big things like actually you're going to not be able to replace your gas boiler if it breaks down with a gas boiler. You're going to be looking at something very different, and that could be very expensive. That might not be something that people understand or are expecting. And actually, if we are to hit the government's increased targets around, particularly if I talk about offshore renewable energy, it's because I live in Grimsby, we've got loads of offshore wind, and my organisation represents wind companies. But the amount of offshore wind that we're expected to deliver, even before 2030, is such that it will have a material impact on people's landscape. And we're already starting to see people in communities feeling very concerned about those physical changes. And the Tories are ducking that at the moment, but there will be a lot of communities that feel very unhappy that they don't realise that the infrastructure that will be happening on their doorstep. And there are no conversations happening around that as far as I can see, certainly not from positions of government leadership. So I think that there's a couple of things, you know, people need to be aware that homes and home heating and electric vehicles are the kind of the tangible drivers of change in energy and energy demand. And that will mean that there will be physical differences and possibly individual cost implications. And then for the Labour Party, a little bit of recognising that, you know, we're not the only ones who can be, I don't know, the custodians of something that we believe to be morally correct or ethically right. There are other people doing that in this space, and it might not be to the entirety of the way that the Labour Party would like to see it done. That doesn't mean that it is not going to be meeting the electorate's minimum expectations. So I'm sorry to leave it on a bit of a bum note, but I think, you know, it's a point for contention, and hopefully we'll start a good discussion.
Thank you, Melanie. That's really helpful. And it actually, one of the points you made, I wanted to pick up on in a discussion. And it was, you know, quite rightly, you pointed to the fact that actually, you know, if you go down the average high street across the UK, not many people will know what the term just transition means. And I think it's helpful for the purposes of our discussion today. But I wanted to ask all of the panelists, and I might start with you, Polly, because I know UK 100 specifically do work with communities as to, and local authorities, so how you talk about climate change and how you make it real for communities. So I guess the question is, reflecting on the Labour Party, how can we start to talk about a just transition in a way that our communities will understand across the UK?
Thanks very much for that, Jonathan. There's a couple of questions about that in the chat. There's a couple of things that are really fundamental. I said, like, avoid catastrophizing everything, but we need to remember that when I first started doing stuff on climate change, which was about 12 years ago, when we established the Department of Energy and Climate Change, when we talked about the catastrophes, we were talking about them in Bangladesh. Well, now we have extreme weather events which knock through a bridge in Cumbria, and that knocks out an economy in our country for ages, right? So, and there are now people in this country who can't get insurance on their own homes or their own businesses because they are now in a flood risk when they weren't before. So this isn't just sort of something that happens on the other side of the world to rare species or people that we don't know. It's happening in our communities. So we need to remember that the climate change message needs to be about resilience to things that are going to happen anyway, right? And what is the role of government in protecting you from those things? Because there are certainly situations where the market is unlikely to protect you from those things, or to shape the market so that they can, right? As well as offer you opportunities to do the things you want to do, right? That will also help the planet. Now, nobody spent their time going, oh, do you know what? I really want to go down a mine to be able to drive the Industrial Revolution. They went down a mine because that was the only work that was available. If we, that ended up actually driving a whole different kind of social and economic movement, which resulted in the labour movement that we're now in today. We may well need different kinds of social and economic organisation and political organisation in order to be able to achieve what we're talking about. But we've got the institutions that we've got now. That is local government. It is the trade unions, it is the Labour Party, and also, most importantly, in many ways, establishing a political consensus, which is why we do what we do during the day in UK 100. The last thing we need is a culture war on this. What's very interesting in when we look at what's going on is that pretty much of the mainstream papers now, the only place where you see the sort of culture war klaxon around climate is at the Telegraph, where they are sort of executing a rearguard action against what the government itself is doing on climate. Now, we may not think that what the government is doing on climate is sufficient in terms of meeting the science, let alone meeting any of our sort of bars on social justice or whatever, but there are people who are still going to go, oh, it's going to cost a lot. And if the frame about this is the cost rather than the opportunity, we will lose. What people want is something where they can make sure that families are secure financially. That's why I'm talking about security as distinct from opportunity, because security is the bedrock of opportunity. You can't talk about opportunity unless you feel secure in some basics. And that is about your home, your job, the opportunities that your children might have. And that also is about framing about health and well-being. So I think there is something we can do about this. And it is about saying you have, as particularly working class communities where we've lost industries before, it's about saying we're not going to do that transformation again like that because you got absolutely screwed over. But we do think that you are really well placed, or we as these communities are really well placed, because we've got those skills, because we've got those traditions of being able to roll our sleeves up, get our hands dirty and get stuff done. And that's where we can actually start to build a national mission which connects, as Henna has suggested, the sustainability professional in Shoreditch with the former miner in Mansfield. Because if neither of those can see the value of each other, then we won't be able to establish the national mission, which is really important, particularly to take on some of the really big challenges that Melanie has outlined. This isn't easy, but if you're going to talk about preserving the things that you value and you love, which is your family and the environment in which you live, that does involve some change. So that's how you have to do the trade-off about, yes, you will see offshore wind farms, but at least you'll have a job that's had something to do with creating them. What we found is, like, for example, Steve Rotherham, the Metro Mayor of Liverpool, has quite often pointed out there's a great bloody wind farm off Merseyside and they barely own any of it. And indeed, the jobs that were created for people who live in Liverpool were simply the hotel receptionists and the people who cleaned the hotel rooms, for Danish engineers who came over for the week, for weeks on end to establish them. We don't want it to be like that. We need to be establishing the workforce right here and right now. And that's where there is an important partnership between local and national government to be able to deliver that.
Thank you, Bonnie. And Mel, I wanted to ask you to pick that up as well in terms of Renewable UK, particularly talking to maybe small and medium-sized businesses. Has that cropped up, and how are you approaching that discussion on just transition? Then I'll go on to Darren afterwards.
I think it's interesting actually. A lot of the larger companies that are involved in renewables, they already have their own just transition strategies, which I think is really positive that they've recognised the need for it. I think in the SME sector, that a lot of the concern really is around how do they grow, and there's a lot of effort in that, because actually in terms of communities getting best impact and getting those long-term opportunities, I mean, you know, Polly talks about kind of Danish engineers coming over for construction phase, you know, that's what, I don't know, anything from 2 to 7 years of a build project, and the long-term jobs that come, actually things like operations and maintenance, and that's 25 years minimum of work. But the SMEs are the other place where you can get that, and seeing investment and companies feeling confident in investing is part of making sure that people across the whole country can actually have access to some of those renewable jobs. And we're looking at, you know, growth by the next 4 or 5 years, probably seeing 26,000 direct jobs in offshore wind, going up to 60,000+, which is a significant increase. And looking at where they are based, those are based in the Wirral. They are based all along the east coast and along the coast of Scotland as well. And one of the things I think that Polly touched on, I used to talk about it a lot, same as Steve, this idea that, you know, you can see something, but what benefit does your community get? And that community dividend point is really important. It doesn't all just rest on jobs, I don't think, because I think you can get community support in other ways. And there are energy supplier companies now that are actively engaged in taking over some of the provision of supply, of linking it to their customers, because everything is becoming digitized. So you're paying your bills through an app. You're seeing when the most renewable energy is coming through your app, so you can choose when to, or set when to use electricity at the greenest times. And those companies that are innovating are starting to give people their community benefit. So you can see the wind farm. You can see when the energy you can see on your phone when the energy is coming to your house from that wind farm, whether it's an onshore or an offshore wind farm. You can choose when to use that electricity, and if you choose it at the optimum time, then you get a discount on your bill as well. And it is one of the most easy ways to kind of connect people with that benefit and bring them into the notion that you don't just have to work in the sector, you can get benefits in other ways. A cash benefit is great, but you know, it's a small but tangible way for people to feel connected with the changes that are happening in a positive way.
Thank you, Melanie. And I'm going to bring in Darren. I'm conscious that the chat function is being well used and a number of questions, which is really good. We will be able to pick up on a few of them in just a minute. Darren, it'll be good if you can pick up that question, but also at the risk of using chair's prerogative and giving you 2 questions, but also it'd be good to see where Bay's committee has got to. We talked about jobs, but also linked to that is the investment in skills as well, because we know that, you know, particularly we've got 500 retrofit coordinators, but recent studies show that we need 36,000. You have 5 out of 200 FE colleges which specifically focus on renewables in terms of skills as well. So it'll be a question: has Bay's looked at that, and is that does that need to be a focus for the next Labour government as well?
Sure, thanks. Well, just on the first question of a just transition, I mean, I often think it's easier than we make out. I don't think we should tie ourselves in knots around all of this. I mean, my select committee with five others commissioned the Citizens' Assembly on climate change. 108 people across the country brought together to understand and vote on the trade-offs required to reach net zero by 2050. And if you've not seen it yet, there's a documentary about it now on the iPlayer, BBC iPlayer, called The People versus Climate Change, which is worth a watch if you've got a spare hour. And one of the key themes that came through that was fairness. It wasn't called the just transition, and maybe people hadn't really heard of it being spoken about in that way. But what just transition means is about fairness, and people wanted fairness, and they recognize that there'll be people who will be hit harder, whether they work in particular industries or live in particular parts of the country, and we should therefore help them with that transition, and that on the other side we should ensure that the opportunities that are created are shared widely and not just limited to a few who are able to take advantage of them. This, again, as I said in the opening remarks, this isn't new stuff. I mean, this is the whole point of the Labour Party, right? Just because it's in the context of climate change doesn't mean we get kind of caught up in the complexities of it. I think we understand where people's values are. We understand what Labour values are. We just need to modernise our language and approach in a way that connects the two correctly. And I think, you know, we could do that. There's nothing stopping us from doing that. On to the second question around the role of the base committee. So my committee is responsible for holding the business and energy department to account, as I said, including on COP, so a little bit of international work as well. And so we have our heads in the government strategies and delivery every week. We talk to stakeholders from industry reps to trade unions to NGOs to academics to climate change committee, regulators, the whole shebang. And Mel is right that we shouldn't underestimate the Tories. They know that this is electorally an opportunity for them, as it is for everyone, because the public care about it. But I do go back to my point before that I just don't think they know how to deliver on the scale required for delivery. Offshore wind is something that they're putting a lot of energy in, and they've done a good job in bringing that online. But look at heating. The heating and building strategy has been delayed again and again and again. It's a huge job in every single home across the country. We need to get people off of their gas boilers. We couldn't even insulate their roofs properly, let alone go in and change a gas boiler to a heat pump or connect them to a heat network. So don't underestimate the Tories in their understanding of the electoral opportunities, but I don't think they have a clue how they're going to deliver the scale of change required across the country that brings people with them. And the risk there is that if you don't explain to people in advance what the change and the positive change is going to be, when suddenly we get close to those targets and we start then forcing change on people, that's going to be taken very negatively, and you'll lose the public support for this transition that is required. And so I think there's a job there for Labour, not just to hold the Tories to account for their delivery, but to put forward different delivery models in a way that really brings people with us, but provides that change on the scale required. And so my committee will be looking at that. And we tend to focus on particular issues. We're doing an inquiry at the moment in decarbonising heat. We have some work coming up on the power sector, at the industrial decarbonisation strategy we're going to be looking at on Tuesday, as well as our international work through COP26. And this is a constant theme for us week in, week out. But as I say, at the moment, I have no confidence that the government is going to be able to deliver on its own targets and pledges. And we've got to, whilst they're in power, help them do that, because we have to do it. This isn't a party political point, but the Labour Party also needs to be setting out how it's going to do it, because as I said in my opening remarks, I genuinely believe we will only secure fairness and a just transition if Labour is in government delivering on this agenda.
Thank you, Darren. And I'm going to look to some of the questions now. And some theme that has come up, and indeed Mel talked about it in her opening remarks, is actually some of those tough conversations we're going to have, particularly in respect of how we're supporting communities, but actually saying on gas boilers, it's going to be a difficult conversation as to how that you can't replace gas boilers as well. And some of the examples have been put is in some of our cities in terms of creating low emission zones and the potential impact it's had on either delivery drivers, but also taxi drivers as well. So I'll look to Melanie to kick us off on this. Some of these tough discussions, in addition to supporting our communities, how do we have those tough discussions with our communities on measures that need to be brought in to get us to net zero?
Those examples actually are really great, aren't they? Because the breadth of the impact around transition is so vast. I have to say that I tend to think about it, the ones that the ones that I am focused on in my day job are the oil and gas workers. And actually it is so far ranging, you know, all across the country, people are going to be impacted in many different ways. And the conversations, I mean, I don't think that government really is taking a leading role in the discussions. And I think that, you know, if anything, the pandemic has demonstrated, you know, if government puts its mind to it, it can do an awful lot, and it can reach people, you know, in using every single lever that it has at its disposal. But I think that there is more that can be done at a local level. I mean, Polly's here to kind of talk about UK 100. Local authorities would seem to be the most obvious place to start to try and have these conversations and supporting local government in delivering that. But I think that there's opportunities in workplaces as well. And I think that there's an issue about how well equipped people feel. I think there's a lot of language, I've certainly found over the last year, there's a lot of language, both in the environmental sphere and the energy sphere, that's quite exclusive. People like to use their own language, and it kind of keeps other people out. So breaking down some of those barriers, and then making sure that in workplaces people do feel empowered to have those discussions. And of course, you know, trying to get to as many younger people as possible, because it's going to be their lives that will evolve rapidly in the changing landscape. But again, lots of that comes through government. So we have got loads of structures in place. I don't think there's any need to create new structures. I think a lot of it is about method of message delivery, to be honest. And at the moment, it's pretty quiet.
Thank you. Polly, those tough discussions, what's your experience working with local government and regional government leaders, and of course as a councillor as well, in terms of those tough calls and messaging as well?
Well, it's been really interesting about the low traffic neighbourhoods. I think that's a conversation that has dominated particularly in London, and where they have been happening elsewhere. I don't think there's been as much of a media spotlight on them, unsurprisingly, because the media just thinks that nothing really happens outside the M25, and when they do, they explore it as though they've gone somewhere up the Amazon to some rare tribe. And I think that's part of the problem about the nature of the conversations that we're having. We've really worked very hard with our membership to support them to hang tough on the low traffic neighbourhoods on the principle, and to make sure that they acknowledge that they might not have got everything right, and that there are opportunities to tweak. And this is what's really important about the importance of local government and working closely with national government. Remember, low traffic neighbourhoods were enabled by national Tory government with money, which they handed down to local authorities in order to be able to support this, to tackle air pollution and to support social distancing. And then there was some kind of, oh no, it's got nothing to do with us, Gov, and leaving them alone to kind of hang out to dry, which is why we've been supporting them to hang tough. But I know that we've had local leaders sitting down with various different groups of the private and public sector, literally talking about the sequencing of traffic lights, right, in order to be able to make sure that a low traffic neighbourhood works rather than that it doesn't, which goes to my point about the fact that Whitehall needs to understand where it is best placed to enable and where it needs to be able to let other people do stuff well. But this also goes to my point, is we need to understand, I know, look, I'm a councillor in Hackney. We have a significant threat from the Greens in some of our wards. I completely identify with people here from Oxford and Bristol and other places where this is a particular political threat. But I wouldn't overestimate the importance of actual green policies when it comes to green politics and voters, right? I think you can have the best green policies in the world as an administration, and that doesn't necessarily mean much to people who are basically using green votes as a none of the above option in some parts of the country. I would be much more anxious, for example, about us losing the support of people who are struggling and have done the right thing, right? They've gone to college, or they've got a trade, and then suddenly their trade is rapidly changing the ground under them, right? And that goes to Mel's point about the oil and gas workers. They're not bad people. They're just doing a job that gives them an opportunity to be able to put a roof over their heads and to be able to buy a car, to be able to go on holiday. These are reasonable things. And that's where we need to be thinking about the centre ground of British politics, because he'll tell you what, and this is where Darren is right, the government will set those targets. If the market doesn't deliver, they're more likely to shrug their shoulders and go, well, that's too difficult, and leave that to be something which will then say, well, we've had to abandon it. And we need to be able to show that we're offering a political consensus for them to be able to step up and help deliver it, because the science is too pressing for us to make this a political football. The how can be political, but the what needs to be actually quite consensual. And that's not easy for party politicians, indeed even Darren, who has to sort of be in some ways more cross-party because he's chair of a select committee. It's not easy for politicians to do that, but that's why the challenges of climate change for politicians are really quite profound. We have to think about our politics in a different way.
Thank you so much, Polly. And there's so many questions in the chat, and I wish we could get to all of them. What I would encourage panelists, and I know some of the panelists are already doing this, but if you see any question that you can answer, do feel free to pop it in the chat as well. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to go through one round of questioning, and there's something that has cropped up in a number of the questions, in that, we know the climate emergency doesn't stop at our borders. It's an international challenge. I know that Base Committee particularly have done a lot of work on this. And the question is, how do we create that international solidarity as a Labour movement and a progressive Britain to be able to create that international response? And then also, there's been flagged up, how do we learn from progressive administrations like Biden in the US in terms of bringing forward policies? So I'll start with Darren, and then we'll hear from the others.
Sure. Well, other than Biden and Ardern in New Zealand, there's not many progressive governments we can look to, unfortunately, because we keep losing elections. So we need to figure that out first. But when Joe Biden was inaugurated, he gave a speech about his climate change initiatives and said, today is about climate change, but it's also about Jobs Day. He said it better than that. I can't remember his usual words, but essentially he was coupling job creation with his climate initiatives. And he said it as his first speech on this issue, dead and center, so people got it. Now, the thing with the international question, how do we build those international networks? Because to be honest, they don't really exist in a way that it's easy for us to tap into. As a chair of a select committee, I wanted to get in touch with equivalent chairs of equivalent select committees in as many countries as possible around the world in advance of COP, to get a view as to how those select committees felt about their government's ambitions and delivery. Now, not every country has a select committee structure, not every country has a select committee looking at these issues, but essentially the network didn't exist. There was nowhere for us to go. We've started to write to countries where we've identified the committees, but it's been a huge amount of legwork for my clerks to try to identify people to contact in the first place before you can even have the conversation. So we've actually got to build that international network. And wouldn't it be great if the Labour Party, given that so many sister parties are suffering from similar challenges to ours around the world, could start to maybe revamp that international network that used to exist really strongly when many of our parties were in government across the world in the 90s and 2000s, to start talking about this. I know Policy Network has done some work on that, and I'm assuming and hoping that will come through as part of the Progressive Britain network. But we have to get the decisions right in the UK if we're going to ask countries around the world to follow suit. And you will all know it, so I'm not going to list the things off, but the aid budget being cut in particular, when we're telling everybody at COP26, hey, we've got to reach those aid agreements we agreed at Paris 5 years ago, otherwise vulnerable nations who have been hit through the COVID pandemic are not going to be able to afford to fund their infrastructure changes. Oh, and by the way, we're cutting our aid budget. I mean, that's just one example of saying one thing and then doing another. And again, those are the obvious points where we need to hold the government to account on that. But if we can build those international networks, maybe through Progressive Britain and its established network through the former organisation Policy Network, then I think that would be a valuable exercise for us.
Thank you. Polly, how do we learn from administrations like Ardern and Biden as a Labour Party and a Labour movement?
Well, I wouldn't assume that everything that they do is necessarily transferable. And one of the things that sort of builds on what Darren said is that in a lot of ways, it's like don't make this a dividing line. Don't make this about sort of posturing as we are better than those people. The reality is most of the people who are going to have to experience this transition have tougher lives than a lot of the people that are saying they've got to do something different. So that's where I think a little bit less of seeing this as a sort of individual lifestyle choice. Well, I'm better because I use oat milk, and I'm better because I do this. It's not really. And I know that sounds a long way away from Biden and Ardern, but it's basically the point, right? They are getting on with making nation building mission statements to transform economies, not saying, well, you know, if you just turned your thermostat down and put a jumper on and, you know, ate a little bit less meat, then we'd all be better off. If you catastrophize this problem and then your suggestions are all about small behavior change, then you're completely getting it wrong. We need to take the heat out of it, literally take the heat out of the atmosphere and take the heat out of the political atmosphere by making this an issue of political consensus, practical economic transformation, and support for the people who are going to get screwed over. And let's be honest, are the kind of people who've been screwed over again and again and again. So that's why we need to be focusing on those small businesses as well as those particular sectors that Mel's talking about, because those are the people who at the moment will be saying, why on earth, I mean, you know, if you think about the kind of crazy political and economic situation we're talking about now, why on earth should I vote for a party that bangs on about something that I can't see, I can't smell, I can't taste, and all they're doing is threatening my job? So that's why we have to be talking about it in terms of an opportunity for you and your community and your family to be better off with things that benefit you now, better lifestyle, better health and well-being, better job prospects, rather than spending all your time going, well, if you only got a bike, everything will be fine.
Thank you, Polly. And I'll end with Mel, particularly reference to small businesses, Melanie.
I don't even have a bike. How terrible is that? So in reference to small businesses, I mean, I think that, you know, small businesses are run by somebody and somebody works there. And the points that I've made in the chat about, you know, who are we talking to? How are we talking to them? I think that they struggle to know where they're going to fit in to the changes that are coming. You know, there was the launch of the decarbonisation targets, probably, well, coming up for a month ago now, maybe not that long ago. And I just think that it came as a huge shock to lots and lots of people, lots of companies, because it was the first time that it had really been talked about. It's always been something that somebody else would deal with. And they hadn't really expected it to land on their shoulders. And so there's going to need to be a huge amount of support, I think, for those SME businesses in changing the way that they operate, changing the way that maybe changing their public offer or changing their contractual offer, because increasingly what we're going to see is those businesses being squeezed because they will be getting contracts from bigger companies that will have higher expectations in terms of the amount that they, you know, their kind of carbon production. And so they will really struggle. And I don't think that they're prepared for that at all. And that it may well be that we see that that's the turning point, you know, in terms of the kind of honeymoon period for Boris Johnson's government, because if those people start to feel that there are unreasonable expectations in an unreasonable timescale where there is very little support, certainly financially or in terms of policy, then they're quite a powerful group. So we might find increasingly numbers of allies in there.
Thank you so much, Melanie. And that brings us to the end of this session. So I'd like to thank all of the panelists. I think they deserve a round of applause for so much contribution, and thank you. Certainly the things that I'm taking away, the importance of fairness, the importance of addressing the security before opportunity as well. You know, Polly's point of ensuring that we don't catastrophize, we don't over-catastrophize this discussion is really important. Darren, the point you were making on ensuring that this is rebalancing our economy and rebalancing how we approach the economy like we've done before is really important. And Melanie, the points you've made in terms of how we're working with our communities on some of these tough areas is really important, particularly our small and medium businesses as well. So up next is a plenary session with Peter Mandelson. Now is the time for Progressive Britain. And please do stay involved, and I look forward to hopefully being involved in future discussions along this very topic as well. Have a good day. Speak soon all.
Thanks everyone. Bye.